Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this series, we bring in speakers, scholars from across the country to present their research and to engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. And I'm super excited today that we're joined by Dennis Coates, who is a student of Mancur Olson. Mancur Olson is a famous alumnus from NDSU who many people feel would have won the Nobel Prize had he lived longer. So I'm really excited that Dennis flew all the way from Maryland to give a presentation to a virtual audience. Dennis said yesterday, he told me that he was a little bit excited about the possibility of a blizzard because he hasn't seen a blizzard for a while. So in the spirit of North Dakota hospitality, we generated the blizzard for him. So anyway, so this is great. Dr. Dennis Coates is a professor of economics at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. His research interests include public choice, public finance, and sports economics. He received his Ph.D. in economics from the University of Maryland, where he studied under Professor Mancur Olson. Mancur is an alumnus of North Dakota State University, who is an acclaimed author and one of the founders of public choice economics and new institutional social science. And so again, I'm really excited that Dennis is here today, and Dennis will answer your questions after his presentation, or he said he's even willing to answer them during the presentation. So if you have any questions, please ask them at any time. Without any further delay, let's welcome Dennis Coates. So thank you, Dennis.
Thank you. So, I appreciate the hospitality of putting on a blizzard just for me. So thank you for that. And I will do my best to keep you entertained with my talk here. But I want to thank you especially for the invitation to come out here. I haven't traveled much in the last 2 years, as you can imagine. So the opportunity to finally go out on the road and do academic work again was very welcome. So I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate the hospitality, the great dinner that I had last night, and the company, getting to know the folks here that I haven't met before. So thank you very much for all of that. So if you are seeing the slide, you see two different university affiliations. The first is at the top is the Higher School of Economics. That's an organization, a university system in Russia that I work with. I've worked with them for about 4 years, since about 2014, so about 7 years. And the second is my affiliation at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. This work probably would not have happened without that Russian affiliation. So that's part of the reason that I want to emphasize that connection. As we go through the talk, the clicker is not working. There we go. So my motivation here is an interest in economic development. And in particular, when we think about economic development, we think about income growth, employment growth, social institutions being improving. But the focus here is going to be growth in income, whether that's gross regional product or it is income per person, income per capita, in either of those circumstances. In the growth literature, there is a question about convergence. So do institutions exist such that a region that has low income will grow faster so that it converges to or reaches the same level of income as a higher income location? And so we want to look a little bit at that. In doing so, and so that's the basic question: will will the poor regions catch up to the rich regions? So if they're going to, is it the sort of thing that'll happen quickly, or is it the sort of thing that will take a long, long time? Now, what role do institutions play in all of this? And this is a little bit where My connection to Mancur Olson comes into play because one of Olson's primary insights was that institutions can develop over time in such a way that they cause what he called institutional sclerosis. The idea was essentially that a stable society has groups form that are more interested in the share of the pie that they get than they are in the size of the pie for everyone. And so over time, these institutions lead to a slowing down or even a reduction in the size of the pie, a slowing down in the growth or a reduction in the size of the pie. And that's what he called institutional sclerosis. And so this talk is going to be about, in some sense, thinking about what role institutions may play. So they could be political institutions, they could be social institutions, and they could be economic institutions. The focus here is going to be predominantly on economic institutions. That's why the topic is called economic freedom, because this is a way of measuring the strength, the connection of sort of the organizational structure of the economy and its influence on the success of that economy. Political institutions can be voting, can be the extent to which the individuals can participate in their own governance and those sorts of things, and they clearly are important. They're not going to be the focus of what we talk about here. Social institutions can be related to biases, racial biases, gender biases. It can be in the context of a multi-ethnic society, ethnic biases, those sorts of things that would create problems. If you're not part of the in-group, you may struggle to succeed. Again, that's very interesting work, but that's not the focus that we're going to have here. So our major questions are going to be basically two. The first one is, what does economic freedom in the Russian Federation, amongst the regions in that federation, affect the level of or the growth rate of the economies? Lots of work has been done on that outside of Russia, and I'll mention it again in a little bit, but this is the first time that it's really been done for Russia. So the especially unique sort of circumstance that we have here is that we're going to focus on not just does freedom in a particular jurisdiction benefit that jurisdiction, but to what extent does freedom in one jurisdiction benefit other jurisdictions? So if you have better economic institutions in North Dakota, does that provide some benefit to citizens of South Dakota or Montana or Canada? So the neighbor issue. The other piece of this, though, is does this benefit, if one exists, of North Dakota's institutions that affects the neighboring states also redound to North Dakota? So is it in my best interest to have economic freedom for two reasons? One, because it helps me directly, and two, because by helping my neighbors, it helps me. So two different kinds of questions that we're going to focus on and try to address a little bit in this talk. These could be positive or negative, right? So I mentioned the example I gave was of a positive benefit, but it could be a negative benefit. So what do I mean by that? So consider if we are particularly economically free, say here in North Dakota, that firms that might have invested in some other plains state say, you know what, North Dakota is a better environment than these other places, and so we're going to go to those. We're going to go to North Dakota rather than to these other less desirable locations. So that's a spillover that's negative. So it's possible that higher economic freedom in one place has benefits for other places, but it could also have costs for other places. And we don't really know which of those two things is bigger, or even if they exist at all. And so that's one of the things that we're going to try to find out for the Russian Federation. So is this sort of effect limited to the home region? So I've already mentioned, does it help just in North Dakota, or does it spread over to the other jurisdictions, and so on? And then we're also going to think about, what does this do for employment? So it's one thing to think about perhaps and number of businesses. So there's the question of, how does economic freedom in one location affect that location and other locations? And the answer is, well, it could be that it leads to more businesses being created, or it could lead to existing businesses employing more workers. And so the second question we're going to try to answer here is about that. Which kind of effect might there be in thinking about how economic freedom may produce an outcome for the home jurisdiction and the neighboring jurisdictions? So key to all of this is, how are we going to measure institutions? Institutions are difficult things to describe. So since it's going to be hard to describe them, rather than, temperature, we know how to measure that quite precisely. But the quality of institutions, there's not really a precise way to measure that. And so we're going to a variety of different ways, and it has been approached in a variety of different ways in the literature. And one way is surveys. So what do I mean by surveys? So you ask people, what's the business climate like in your jurisdiction? Is it good or bad or whatever? So you just ask them. Well, when you ask them, there's kind of examples of that. So there's something called the Corruption Perceptions Index, where people are surveyed from all over the world, and they're asked, how corrupt do you think country X is? And then the responses are aggregated and put into a numerical form. In some countries score high, in some countries score lowly on. Similarly for states, can do the same thing. Another one, and this is one that's particularly relevant for the regions of Russia, is that there's an agency called, interestingly enough, the Expert Rating Agency, which does exactly this year by year on number of metrics related to institutions in the regions of Russia. But it is purely a survey. And the result of it is not a score like, say, a rating of 83 out of 100, but rather it's a ranking. So this region of Russia falls third relative to the other regions, or it falls 28th or something like that. So it's purely a ranking, and it's not something that you can think about slight improvements in the quality of the institutions. There's problems with surveys, and what are they? Well, they're expensive, generally speaking. If you're going to conduct a survey of thousands of people, you're going to have to somehow get together the information from all of those people. It might be having people call them on the phone. It might be sending out surveys in the mail. And all of that's going to be expensive to do. Because it's expensive, it's also infrequent. So rather than do it in some cases every year, like the Expert Rating Agency, and involved, other surveys of the institutions are done only every 5 years, and that's very difficult to really link those measures of institutions to what happens on a yearly basis in a country or a region. And they're also very subjective. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is their opinion. And my opinion and your opinion don't have to be related in any way, and they don't have to be related to anything objective or based in fact. It is purely subjective. And so if you've got a different set of individuals to survey, you could get quite different answers. Another way to measure institutions is by looking at the content of the policy. And so one way here to think about the content of the policy is to classify the law. So you know what the law is, and you look at that law very carefully, and you decide to give it a score that says that is maybe highly business friendly versus moderate business friendly versus only a little bit business friendly or something like that. So again, it's each person could decide to write that a little bit differently. And you can do that, for example, with the tax code. You can do it for minimum wage legislation and things of that sort to give these things a score. And the question then goes back to what I said earlier. What are the institutions that we're thinking about? Which ones are truly economic? Which ones are more personal? Which ones are social? And which ones are political? So, for example, is a law on, say, the legality of marijuana sales, is that an economic regulation? Is it a political regulation? What exactly is it? Where do you put it? What about a law that says you have to register your automobile? All of these things are going to be subjective in what category you put them. And so whether we're talking about economic institutions or political institutions can be very complicated when you're thinking about these laws and how they may affect the economy. Well, I always seem to do that sort of goofy thing with my slides. So observational data, and that's what we're going to use here, is observational data. And what do I mean by observational data? Mostly this is going to be government generated data. So the government collects information from businesses, from individuals, say through the census, or there's a census of businesses, through the tax code and a variety of other ways. All of these produce data like spending on consumer goods or investment in plant and equipment or whatever, subsidies to companies. These are hard data. It's not my opinion that this is how much was spent. This is how much was spent. So they're hard data in that sense. They're objective in that sense. But these also have problems. What kind of problems? Well, places have differences in their reporting. So the way things are reported in one region of Russia doesn't have to be exactly the same way as they're reported in another region of Russia. And certainly Russian reporting and American reporting don't have to have any commonalities or have very few commonalities. And so when you have that kind of data, it's going to be difficult to know if any sort of differences in the measurement of the institution is really the institutions or because of something about the way those different places collected their data. Second thing is that a notion like economic freedom is to some extent a very loaded, value-laden notion. What do I mean by that? Well, as I'll show you in a minute, the idea in economic freedom in the way that it's computed basically is that, to take government spending here or subsidies to companies as an example, any region that gives more subsidies than the very minimum number of subsidies in the data is said to be less free than the place that does the minimum. well, okay, I'll take that as an acceptance, but I'll accept that. But is it really fair to say that the minimum amount of subsidy spending is an indication of great economic freedom or not? Just because it's the smallest doesn't mean it's very good. And so that's going to be a complication. We don't know what the social value is. Other reasons or other objective measures, and one of them is Olson from his 1984 book, The Rise and Decline of Nations. He used was the number of lobbying kinds of organizations. So how many labor unions do you have? How many chambers of commerce and association of dairy farmers and print associations and all of them as a measure of the institutions, the number of organizations seeking to have a share of the pie. So that would be a way to do it. Another way to do it is to count up, this is going back to the law, so to speak, count up the number of things one has to do to be able to form or organize a new business. So how many applications do you have to put out? How many permits do you have to have? How many inspections are required? Ah, okay. Sorry about that. Is that okay? So, so this method, the number of procedures, how much do you have to do in order to start up your new business? That would be a way of thinking about how free it is or how easy it is to be an entrepreneur, for example. So what I'm going to do now is specifically about Russia and the Economic Freedom Index for Russia. And so what happened here is I met a Russian woman at a conference. Her name is Irina Mirkina, and she had done an incredible amount of work putting together all of this Russian data from Russian government websites into a single place. And that data was the data that would be used in an economic freedom index in the US, for example, the economic freedom of the states. It's the data that would be used there. I said, you know, do you ever think about creating this economic freedom index for Russia? And she said, no, but that's a great idea. Let's do it. So we did. And so we have this publication that does that. I'm going to talk to you about how it was done, what the data shows a little bit, and then we're going to use that data. Okay, so basically we just follow the methodology that's already existing in the economic freedom of North America. So we're going to collect information from the individual regions of Russia on things like government spending, subsidies for housing, numerous things, tax policy, and so on. And we're going to create index numbers for those things in the way that I described very quickly before, but I'll be more precise about in a moment, to come up with an index that shows the relative freedom, economic freedom in each of the regions across Russia. So the data that we have in that index goes from basically the fall of the Soviet Union, 1992, through 2018. Why 2018? That's the last year the data was available when we were finishing up that project. So probably we could do 2019 now, but we have not yet. We're going to use 80 regions from the Russian Federation. And that's not all of the regions that there are in Russia. One region that we don't include, and you may have heard of this, is Crimea. Why do we not include Crimea? Well, because it wasn't part of Russia for most of our period. It's only been part of Russia since the annexation in 2014. So we don't include that. There's others that we don't include as well. They tend to be really small, and sometimes in the data they're actually aggregated with neighboring regions because they are so small. So there's 84 regions, we're down to 80 for these reasons. So here's the methodology in a little bit more detail. And so each variable is specific to the region. Okay, so we have, say, government spending in the Moscow region. Now, Moscow is interesting because there's Moscow City and there's Moscow Oblast, which is essentially the area around Moscow. It creates problems for us because during the middle of our data, some of the surrounding area was annexed into the city. So in many instances, we just add the two together. We have policies specifically that the regional authorities can affect. If it is something that is purely determined at the federal level, then every region is going to have that same circumstance, and so it wouldn't make any sense and it wouldn't accomplish anything to try to link local or regional economic freedom to something that the region couldn't possibly change and is the same in every single region. So we want only those things that they really can affect, and we're going to get most of this data from what are called income and product accounts, which for econ students for sure, you've probably heard of those. That's how we compute our own GDP, for example. So let's take an example of an individual variable. Probably that's too small to see. I'm sorry if it is. What we have there is a ratio. In the numerator of the ratio is the difference between the maximum value of this variable across the data and this particular region's value of that variable. In the denominator, we have the difference between the maximum value and the minimum value. So the denominator is the range of values that occur. That's going to be the same for every region for a given variable. The numerator is what's going to vary from region to region. Now, clearly, if you are in that region that has the minimum value of that variable, the ratio is 1. And so you get a score of 10, because there's a factor of 10 there. And what that means is that you are at the highest value on economic freedom for that index. If, on the other hand, you have the maximum value of that variable in your region, then the numerator is 0, and you have the least amount of economic freedom across the regions. Okay, so we compute that for a variety of variables, and here I've just said what the least and the most economic freedom are. We compute that index for a variety of variables, and I've already mentioned them, and they are divided into 3 areas. In the North American index, there's more than 3 areas. In the Economic Freedom Index of the world, there's, I think, 7, if I remember right, areas. Here we only have 3. And the 3 that we have are government spending, taxation, and regulation. What are the differences? Well, the differences are, why do we only have those 3 and not the same number as, say, in the Economic Freedom Index of the world? The reason is because many of the components are things that are chosen at the national level. So monetary freedom is about monetary policy. Regions, just like states in the US, don't have any influence over monetary policy, and so we don't include that. There are things that we would like to include, but we can't, having to do with the quality of the courts. There's just not good data on that information. but it would be ideal if we could put it in. Once we've done that, we average across those areas to produce the entire index. Now what you're looking at here is for 2018, it's a map of Russia that shows by the color the degree of economic freedom. And the darker the color, the more or the higher the economic freedom score in that region. Okay, so one of the things that you can clearly see is out here in the far eastern portion of Russia, economic freedom scores tend to be lower. In the more European portions, they tend to be a little bit higher. So right around here, this is sort of east of the line that I'm drawing to the left is east of the Ural Mountains. That would be European portion of Russia, roughly speaking, and everything to that direction would be the Asian portion. And so what you see largely, though not exclusively, is that economic freedom is more evident, is stronger in the European portion of Russia than it is in the Asian portion of Russia. But there are exemptions or exceptions to that rule. And here, this is my favorite place in Russia, Kaliningrad. It's not contiguous. There's actual countries in between. That's just a historic fact from World War II. But you see that Kaliningrad doesn't have a particularly high economic freedom score. And you have down in the Caucasus areas, like in here, Chechnya, which you maybe have heard about civil wars in Chechnya, not particularly economically free there. But then you also have areas like Moscow would be up in here, very high economic freedom score. And the area where I go is right here, pretty high economic freedom score. So we have this for a particular year and how it varies across the country. And just as a matter of interest, Russia's a huge country. There's 11 time zones. 11 time zones. That's pretty amazing. So this also doesn't show up wonderfully, but basically what it shows you is year by year what's happened to economic freedom in the regions of Russia. And what I want you to notice is 1992 here, it's actually pretty high, but it plummets in the early part of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then it rises steadily. What was going on during that period when it was rising was basically with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was really nobody in control at the central government, and the regions were all able to go their own way, so to speak, making their own policies. And so freedom got very strong, relatively speaking, during that time period. Then you notice right about here, you can't read it probably, it says 2000. Do you know what happened in 2000? Vladimir Putin became the president of Russia. And one of the things that he did was try to exert or re-exert centralized control, and boom, the economic freedom falls pretty substantially as he does that. Now it's rebounded a little bit, but basically since about 2005, the mean value of it has not changed much. It's been pretty much constant over that time, on average. Within a given year, regions bounce around. So if you're at the top one year, doesn't mean necessarily that you're at the top the next year. And in fact, if you look at it a little bit, you might see that this from here to here is a bigger range than out here. So what we see is them collapsing around the same mean value. Okay. How's that? Yeah, that's probably not any better, right? So that's the story with what's happened over time. And so what Irina and I did was, with the original data, was just said, well, let's look and see what's happening to the growth rate. And in particular, as economic freedom changes in each of these regions or changes over time, what's happening to the growth rate of these the different regions. And so what we have here in this is three different values or three different measures of outcome. So the first one here is wages, the second one is GRP, or gross regional product, and the third one is income. And what we did was a technique called quantile regression. And what quantile regression does is allows you to think about and to ask the question of, is there a difference in the impact of this variable at a low percentage if you think about the relationship at a low value of the distribution versus a high value of the distribution. The typical regression puts a line right through the middle, or the 50th percentile. This says, let's put our regression line through the 10th percentile or the 20th percentile or so on. So it's allowing us to find out if there is in fact the same relationship throughout or different relationships in different places. And what you see here, and I won't use the pointer, but what you can see here in the slide is that at very low quantiles, so very low percentages of the wage or GRP or income, slight improvements in economic freedom have a positive effect. At the other end, when you already are at a very high relative amount of wages, slight improvements in economic freedom don't actually improve wages, gross regional product, or income. And then there's a broad area where there's no effect. Now, why is that interesting? Basically, it's interesting because it tells us that we have to be more nuanced in thinking about what economic freedom does and does not do. It has distributional implications. More economic freedom doesn't necessarily benefit all portions of the income distribution the same way. So, the unanswered questions that I want to do here, or talk a little bit about here, is what's the mechanism? I mentioned that earlier. Is it inefficiency, that improving economic freedom improves efficiency in the economy and that leads to the growth? Is it because of inefficiency generated by regulation? Is it because of inefficiency generated through lobbying? So that would be kind of the Olsonian story. Is it inefficiency that's generated through cronyism? So we give the contracts to our buddies, that sort of thing. And cronyism in Russia is a very big problem. The other thing is to think about public goods. So good institutions are public goods in the sense that everybody can benefit from those good institutions without it imposing any cost on anybody else. And so the question is, does greater economic freedom serve this kind of a public good benefit or not? And then the last thing, and I mentioned this very briefly before, and this is where the focus will be for the next couple of minutes, is on spillovers. So when one region has more economic freedom, does that do better for that region and its neighbors? Does it do better for that region and through helping or hurting its neighbors come back to help or hurt it as well? So that's the spillover idea. Does this spill over across regions, across neighbors? And notice I have neighbors in quotation marks there because neighbors can be defined in a variety of ways, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So Another one of the colleagues or a colleague from one of the institutions I work with in Russia is a woman named Olga Demidova. And she is an expert in this sort of spatial regression technique that I've mentioned. So I'm going to talk about what we do there using the spatial regression technique. So what we want to do is think about how influential what goes on in the neighbor's region is on this region. And so what we have to do is develop a weight. So a region, to think about it in the simplest way, could have no influence on another region simply because it's so far away. It could have no influence simply because it doesn't have a border. And that would be two different ways of thinking about what those weights should be. Do they have contiguous borders or not? And so here's my example, and I mentioned this before. Think about the weights. You put a 1 on Minnesota, South Dakota, and Montana, and you put a 0 on every other state. So there is a direct influence of North Dakota on Minnesota and of Minnesota on North Dakota and so on. Any other state doesn't share a border with North Dakota, and so there's no influence of what goes on there. Is that true? Yeah, it's, one might question whether that's true or not. Alternatively, what I mentioned was called inverse distance. And I mentioned the distance, how far away is it? So what we do is the inverse distance. So the farther away, the smaller the influence. Okay? So those are two different ways of thinking about how influential a neighbor might be on a jurisdiction. And the inverse distance is measured state capital to state capital, or regional capital to regional capital in Russia. You can imagine that there's going to be some problems with that in a place like New England, where the states are small and close together. The distances are going to be close. Does that really mean that there's a strong relationship, strong impact of one on the other? I'm not so sure. Likewise, out in the West, in the Plain States, large distances, does that mean that there's really very little influence? And what about, I'll take here, you got the largest city in the state is right on the border with the next state, but the capital is a long ways away, right? Is the capital really the right distance to use? I'm not sure. So there's questions about what the right sort of measure of or weight should be. So we do it with both types of measures. There's also another, what's going on here? Okay, so we have what's called panel data. So we have regions across time. And our time is basically post-2000 up to 2018. The reason for that is because of data availability. If you go back farther, some of the variables we need to use don't exist or haven't been consistently collected. And so this is going to be a little bit technical, and I'm sorry if that's too confusing, but I'll try to make it really intuitive in a minute. So what we have in this regression equation is the relationship between some outcome, let's say income Y, and it depends upon a bunch of variables like economic freedom, those are in X, in the current state, but also X in the neighboring states. The W's represent the weights. So in our scheme, some of those W's are, if it's contiguous, would be 1s and some would be 0s. And then the outcome in the neighboring states. And that would be the thing that looks like what does it look like? A lollipop, I guess. It's called the Greek letter rho, with the weights and the Y variable. And that lollipop variable is the correlation, the relationship between what goes on in the other state's outcome and this state's outcome. At the end of the equation, where there's the thing that looks like a circle with a line through it, theta, that is how does the other state's economic freedom affect this state? Okay, so we can also do that with what's called a dynamic panel. All that means is we have the outcome variable for the current state in the previous period as well. And we've done it both ways. So if you're familiar with regression, you probably think, okay, what we have here is a regression, and the impact of economic freedom, the X variable up there, is going to be the beta coefficient on economic freedom. And unfortunately, that's not true. And I'm going to show you why it's not true. The reason is basically, and I'm going to show you precisely why in just a second, is that the marginal effects are going to depend upon the weights and all the other parameters in the model. So think about it like this. I have two regions, region I and region J. And what we have here is economic freedom in region I influences gross regional product in region I. Gross regional product in region I affects gross regional product in region J. And economic freedom in region J affects gross regional product in region J. Okay? According to the regression, though, we also have that the outcome, gross regional product in region J, affects gross regional product in region I and vice versa. Okay? So I took and just wrote this for a single region, region 1. And then I have up here Y2. So there's only two regions. This is how region 2 influences region 1. So what I did was wrote that equation again, substituted for Y2 exactly that mess, changing 1s to 2s. And what it shows you is you can come up with this. And this is what's technically known as a big mess. Right? It's just a confusing mess of stuff. And here's what's important about it. Here's what's important about it. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, so here's where you see it. I'm going to point, I don't know if that's going to be better than the pointer, but here we have X1. So think of that as economic freedom in region 1. It's going to influence gross regional product in region 1 two ways. Directly, that's this first piece, and indirectly, that's this piece. So when we want to know what's the impact of greater economic freedom in region 1 on region 1, we have to compute that mess to get both the direct effect and the indirect effect. Okay? So what about economic freedom in region 2? Well, that also has both a direct effect and an indirect effect. So before the plus sign up here is the direct effect, after the plus sign is the indirect effect. And what you see is all of those effects depend on the regular parameters, the betas, the slope parameters, and so on, but they also depend upon the weights. They depend upon how correlated one state is with another state, or one region with another region, and how much or how strong the spillovers are from region to region. Okay? So I hope with that you see why we think about these indirect and direct effects, and how important it is to not just focus on the coefficients from the regressions, which, by the way, I'm not going to show you anyway, but just so you know that when we talk about the indirect and the direct effect, there's a very clear reason for doing so. So if we explain regional gross regional product in this regression framework, we're going to use the share of the population that lives in urban centers. We're going to use investment as a share of gross regional product. We're going to use imports and exports, so how much does that region trade with other regions? We're going to use the number of road kilometers as a measure of how developed it is. How many patents were registered in that region? And the economic freedom index. We're also going to include what are called regional fixed effects. This is what happens here that is unique to every place else, but is the same over time. Like what? Well, geography, climate. Those are things that don't change over time within a region, but would be different from region to region. And then time period. So this set of years versus that set of years. If you're familiar with what's happened in Russia over the period of our data from 2000 roughly to 2018, we had a big financial crisis that occurred in 2008. We had the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So the period up to the financial crisis, the period between the financial crisis and the annexation of Crimea, and then the period since then. We account for those three different time periods. And then, as I said, we could do a dynamic panel model, and so that would be including the previous year level of the outcome. So here are our results. The short and the long run effects are different. So if we do the dynamic panel model versus just the regular panel model, we get different answers. Economic freedom is statistically significant and positive in many instances, but its response is really small. So on the order of, say, an elasticity, meaning if economic freedom increases by 10%, then the output, gross regional product, might increase by 2.8% or 4% or something like that. So kind of what we would call inelastic. The dynamic and the static models produce different results. So that's sort of the same thing as the first point, except here it's specifically related to economic freedom as opposed to all the other variables in the model as well. The type of weighting matrix that we use, so I mentioned two, the inverse distance and the contiguous borders. You get different answers depending on which one you use. In that case, it's mostly about the size as opposed to statistical significance. It tends to be a little larger when you use inverse distance than when you use contiguous borders. And then urban share, imports and exports, and patents all have positive signs as we were expecting. The others, not so much. Not always statistically significant, sometimes statistically significant and opposite what we thought their effect would be. Okay, so this is really the key point. And since I've only got 6 minutes left, I will stop basically after I talk about this. And I'm happy to take questions for as long as people want to ask them. The indirect effect and the direct effect are about the same size. Meaning, if I were to go back and show you what the relationship on economic freedom might look like, there were two pieces of it. One was our economic freedom affecting us directly, and our economic freedom affecting the other region, and that coming back and affecting us. And those two are about the same size. And in some instances, the indirect is actually bigger. Now that's really, I think, an interesting and important result because it points out how important economic freedom is in your jurisdiction, even if every place around you is absolutely full of regulations restricting what people can do. It's better for you to be free no matter what happens elsewhere. Your freedom helps the other place, and that comes back to you as well. So I don't want to push this too far because we don't actually have international trade in here. But if I think about international trade, one of the issues is about trade barriers. Oh, we need to have jobs at home. We're going to put up barriers to keep people from importing or exporting products. We're going to put on tariffs. in the 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, they called it a beggar thy neighbor policy. We're going to hurt the neighbor to help ourselves. And if this result carries over from the regions of Russia to the broader context of the world, it says doing that, and I think we all really kind of learned this in the 1930s, but we're a kind of a thick-headed species, I think, and we forget things that we learned. What this says is if every place else is doing something really bad for their economic freedom, we should not do that too. We should still maintain our freedom. And so with that, I think I'll stop since there's only 3 minutes left according to that clock, and I will take your questions.
I do have a question from the online audience. You can just repeat it. So somebody asked, some measures show that after Putin held power in 2000, Russian GDP per capita grew dramatically, while your data suggested this decline in economic freedom during the same period. How can we explain this?
So the question was, post-2000, that Russian GDP increased, whereas we showed that economic freedom declined. And the answer is really fairly straightforward. It is essentially oil markets. Oil prices improved. The Russians began exporting more oil, and so that had a really big impact on the economy there. You have sort of Russia becomes like Saudi Arabia, becomes very rich from selling oil, particularly to Europe. And some of the problems they've had since that time is the oil prices collapsed.
Yeah, I think you have an interesting, one interesting result is with the different quantile effects. Mm-hmm. And so you find that the effects are really high for economic freedom on the low income quantiles and then low on the high income quantiles. Does that suggest that it's because maybe the harm of lack of economic freedom is due to cronyism? In other words, the cronies, when there's more economic freedom, they don't have those same benefits of cronyism, so they're not helped out, whereas the lower income quantiles who are not part of the crony network
and I showed the impact of economic freedom was greater at low quantiles of the income distribution than at high income quantiles of the distribution. Could some of that be explained by greater cronyism being a problem at the high income distribution, high income values of the distribution, versus at the low income distribution, cronyism not being an issue? And I think there is probably something to say about that is the case, that with higher levels of economic freedom, it's harder to be crony capitalists. And so that to the extent that that crony capitalism maybe is actually, to the extent that it's harmful, or actually to the extent that it's beneficial in this case, right, because it's slower economic growth, when there would be less potential for the crony capitalism, that I think is actually against our result. But I'm not positive. I have to think about that more, but that's an interesting conjecture, and I have to see if I can think about how we can address it.
There's another question from online. First, a few compliments to you. Great talk. I enjoyed it a lot. You can repeat that or not. Do you have any thoughts on institutional change? Like, what's your opinion on what factors are most important for more versus less economic freedom?
That's a really interesting question, and thank you for finding it interesting. I always. I'm sorry.
You might have to repeat it.
So the question was, what factors do I think might be more important for improving economic freedom. So amongst the characteristics that generate economic freedom, which should we focus on? I hope that's what the point was. Which of those should we focus on? And that's a very tough question, in part because, and this is always the cop-out, it depends. So what does it depend on? If you're talking about the economic freedom index of the world, which would have sort of the components that I've already talked about, but also components related to monetary freedom and openness of trade borders and so on, I think that openness of trade borders would be far more important than, to me, than things like having Bitcoin be our way of doing transactions. That would presumably be very high economic freedom and the monetary freedom. I don't think that would be a good idea, but I don't have any evidence for that. That's just my opinion. Putting it in the context of this talk with respect to Russian economic freedom, I think that there's a couple of places where it would be really important for the Russian regions to focus. One of them is on their individual tax policies. There's not a lot that the regions have strong influence over with respect to tax policies, but there are some significant places. So like what? Do they tack on a little bit to business taxes? They don't have to do that. They could do away with that. Do they have high taxes on vehicle ownership and registration? They could reduce those. Would it have a big impact? I don't know if that specifically, but when we look at the individual components, and I didn't talk about this at all here, it is the tax component where often the results are being driven. What I mean by that is the others don't necessarily show much of an impact, but the tax does. And so if they were to focus on anything, I think improving tax freedom would be the way to go. That some of the things that are typically used are not available. So in the economic freedom of North America or the economic freedom of the world index, there's things measuring the number of labor unions or labor union participation. We don't have any of that information, basically because, the Soviet Union was, quote unquote, the workers' paradise. You didn't need to have a union because it was all run by the workers. And so unions really don't have much influence. They don't very often strike. They don't negotiate with management much. And so a place where here we might think, if we could get some of this under control, it would be beneficial. There, it really isn't such a big deal. And it's not in our index. And so that's sort of a misdirection because of struggling to answer the direct question about which should be improved. The tax area, I think, is absolutely someplace that they should think about. They also have a lot of government spending that is direct income support. So you can retire much earlier in Russia than here with a full pension. And that may be an issue, especially in a place that has lost a huge proportion of its population over the last 25 or 30 years. So much so that there are programs to incentivize having children.
So I know we're at a time. Can I speak at one last?
Fine by me.
Okay. What is the reliability of Russian domestic data? How much do you trust the self-reporting of Russian agencies and firms?
Yeah.
We'll close on that one.
Thanks. I'm going to cry now. No. Things like how much government spending they do particularly because a lot of the money the regions are able to spend is actually money sent to them by the national government. I think those figures are probably reliable. One of the things that we don't include, and we've gotten pushback on not talking about corruption, is because it's so hard to know how you would actually measure corruption. It's not typically in an economic freedom index anyway, but those numbers we would be very suspicious of. Numbers about the value of exports and imports, those I think are pretty reliable, because the person that you bought it from or that you sold it to also has to report something, and so there's going to be some consistency there. But you know, that's not to minimize the concern that maybe it's all made up. If it was Chinese data, I wouldn't buy it at all. I wouldn't think any of it was true. But here I think we're probably not on perfectly solid ground, but more solid than in many instances.
Thanks for a great.
Thank you.